We thought it was possible. We hoped it was possible. We had a few, very early on when we ran our first pilot, we had a few community leaders that came to us and said, it is possible, and we're going to do this. So it was very much kind of a wing and a prayer at that point. And we went into our first community, and a group of 60 people signed up for the first pilot, which we weren't expecting. It was 59 women and 1 man, and we had to accept the man because he was morbidly obese. So it was kind of a women's group with a token man. And that was really interesting, because what happened on that pilot, which was only 6 weeks, the first pilot we ran, was the results were absolutely exceptional, so exceptional that we were compelled to continue.
Welcome to At the Helm, the podcast that explores food as medicine and food-first treatments for chronic disease. Today, I am delighted to be talking to Jayne Bullen in the Western Cape, near Cape Town in South Africa. Jayne is the Chief Operating Officer of the Noakes Foundation, which this year celebrated its 10th anniversary. And with Professor Tim Noakes and colleagues, she also established the Eat Better South Africa program. We'll talk quite a bit about that today, I hope. Jayne also founded and is the managing director of Nutrition Network, which is a worldwide organization now to train health professionals to safely and effectively support patients in low carbohydrate eating. So Jayne has an MBA from Leeds University, and she initially gained global experience in the world of big business and research. And then she used this experience to change tack and effect change in human health, specifically with healthier eating amongst some of the most disadvantaged people in the world. On her LinkedIn profile, she writes, I'm going to read this, "My superpower is seeing the potential in others and uncapping it." Well, we're going to talk to Jayne about that superpower today and how she is using it to help improve the health of South Africans by promoting therapeutic nutrition, especially low-carb eating, as a way to reverse type 2 diabetes and everything that goes with it, the other chronic conditions, insulin resistance, Alzheimer's disease, mental health problems, obesity, you name it, etc., etc. So welcome, Jayne. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today. And I'm going to point out that we are actually compatriots, because you might detect the vestiges of a South African accent.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah,
of course it's still there.
I've been in Canada since 1986, but I still come regularly to do my paleontology research in South Africa. But so it's wonderful to have you with us. But I want to just start off by asking you a question. And when I'm in South Africa, I just hear so many people talking about banting. Are you banting? Are you banting yet? How's the banting going? And it took me a while to cotton onto this, because in North America, we don't talk about banting. But in South Africa, if you're talking about banting, it means a low carbohydrate, high fat approach to your diet. And it's called after William Banting, the very overweight undertaker from the 19th century in England, who was the first to report success with this kind of diet to lose an immense amount of weight. So are people still talking about banting there? It's an odd thing.
It's still the word that we use in this country. It's extraordinary. And we've got kind of a combination of Prof. Noakes and John O'Proudfoot, who published The Real Meal Revolution, to blame for it. They decided that we needed a kind of fun colloquial word, and they just came up with banting, obviously off the back of William Banting. And the man that invented insulin is also called Banting, which is an interesting one. So the combination, it's obviously got some kind of synchronous connection to diabetes, and is a word that's very, very familiar in this country. So we ask if they've got, people, because you've traveled here extensively, a lot of places have a Banting menu, and everyone knows what it means, which is quite fun. But it has changed. Things have changed. People know what keto is now, which they didn't back in 2013, 14. So yeah, it's another South African word that's kind of been exported a little bit, but we really know what it is here.
Right. I thought I might be able to blame you for this word banting, but you're putting the blame onto Tim and
And I'm
John.
blaming him.
Right. But yeah, what I'd like to just find out from you what it's like in South Africa these days, because look, in North America these days, type 2 diabetes numbers are through the roof, epidemic proportions, and increasing, as are mental health problems, as is Alzheimer's disease, as is obesity. It's epidemic, and it's getting worse, and it's bankrupting the system. None of it is good. And it's estimated, up to 85% of people are metabolically unhealthy. So I would just like to know what it's like now in South Africa. Are things better or worse or similar? Can you just bring us up to date?
So things aren't as bad as they were a couple of years ago across the board. So the data is the same. Things are as bad as they are everywhere, if that makes sense. But what I noticed is the incredible difference in North America from pre to post COVID. I used to travel, kind of travel there a couple of times a year, and there were a couple of years gap. And then I came over last year for the first time again, and the deterioration in food quality, sugar quantity, the increase in sugar, and the actual general state of the nation has deteriorated faster than it has here. And I think there are a number of reasons why. One of which is the actual adoption and acceptance of the low-carb diet here in quite a deep endemic way. I think that's one of the reasons. And I'm not sure if that's been your experience here, but hasn't felt as though things have got as bad as quickly. We were number 2. We were the second most obese country in the world in 2019, I believe, and we're now not even in the top 10. And that's because a lot of the other countries have got more obese quicker per capita. But that's not to say we're in the, we're out of the, we're in the green. We have got 62% of women are obese or overweight. 48% of men. We are in the same situation. We're all in the same problem. We're all in the same crisis. I think it's a global problem to some extent. So we've all got the same work to do.
Yeah, and I don't think we're too far behind the USA here in Canada, where I am. I'm in British Columbia. But at the same time, I mean, there is just a whiff of encouragement in what you're saying there about South Africa. And the fact that you've changed your position on those statistics from pretty bad to not as bad as other countries. I mean, there's something to be grateful for there, I would think. But I'd love to ask you about the Noakes Foundation, but maybe just for viewers and listeners who are not aware of who Tim Noakes is, I can just give a very brief summary. So Tim is a runner, an athlete, a doctor. He founded the Institute for Sports Science at the University of Cape Town. Believe it or not, Jayne, I used to be one of Tim's guinea pigs when I was a medical student back in the 1970s. He would put me on his treadmill and he would calculate my VO2 max because I'm a runner as well. But
Amazing.
he's regarded as a guru, an icon. He's a hero to many. He's written some amazing books. That is Tim Noakes, and so is that. And so Changing Beliefs is one of his best-known books. And this other one here is actually a biography written about him. I mean, you've got to be someone to have a biography written about you. And he also wrote Law of Running, which is regarded as the runner's Bible, except we have to ignore anything that he wrote in there about carbohydrates because he changed his tack. But
yeah,
one of the interesting things about, but Tim actually took on the sports drink companies at one point, and marathon runners were dying from hypo and low sodium because of the way they were hydrating in the marathons. And Tim took them on. He's not shy. He just speaks his mind. And he thought this would take about a year, maybe. I think it took 10 years because he encountered so much pushback. But eventually he won that battle. And then he developed type 2 diabetes. And he realized that the way to reverse it was through a low carbohydrate, high fat approach. And he changed tack. And the most amazing thing to me, he had the courage to admit he had been wrong. He said, sorry, folks, I got it all wrong. Now here's what I'm thinking today. And that's just so courageous. And I wish so many other experts would do that. But he had the grace to apologize. But he paid for it. There was that tribunal with the Health Professionals Council of South Africa. And That took
Yeah.
years and years for him to be vindicated, but in the end it was. But it must have been incredibly traumatic. I mean, I think he's probably paid more of a price for being so upfront about his beliefs than anyone else I know of in the low carb movement. But and the investigative journalists came along and showed that what was behind that case was industry with deep
A lot
pockets.
of complicated.
Yeah, so all that stuff, you got to follow the money. Where's the money? But anyway, you are the chief operating officer of the Noakes Foundation. I think you've been for the duration of, which is now 10 years of the Noakes Foundation. So I just want to congratulate you on that, reaching the 10-year mark. But can you tell me anything about the foundation and how it's going?
Yeah, I mean, so I was the first employee of the foundation, and it was very much at the time back when low carb was, banting was just taking off. People were very, very unsure of it. And then quite quickly after I joined the foundation, and, we started building some of our projects, this big trial with the Health Professions Council of South Africa hit. And ultimately the attempt was to silence, certainly Tim Noakes, but more to silence the science. No one wanted this new information, this emerging science to come out because it questioned so many existing beliefs and systems. And I think it was almost like too much information for anyone to process, because and we've all of us that are in the low carb movement and that have adopted a ketogenic or a lower carb approach to our diets know this. It's kind of a bit like opening a Pandora's box. And it's a bit like one to change one thing, you have to change everything. And I do think that, as Tim Noakes, true to his nature, he came a little bit before his time with this information, before the scientific community was ready to receive it. So the pushback was so massive. And what happened with that pushback as a foundation was that we were given this golden opportunity to really, really actually voice the science. It gave us a global media platform. It gave us absolutely massive interest from every kind of area, particularly the media. They were here, the world media was here to listen and to cover this trial. And the media, the South African media was there, and we sat there for 4 years. It went on and on. So as the story unbundled, the science unbundled with it. And that, of course, helped all of us, around the world, because it was such an extensive inquiry into the truth of what was going on here, and it made it almost impossible to be silenced. And that gave us as a foundation the most incredible platform to fund and to do good research, and then to kind of start to build from there and to start to build these community programs that became so important to us ideologically and in principle in South Africa, and then to the people that did them, because they worked. So what later became Eat Better South Africa was really just us saying, well, this isn't fair that in our country so few people have access to this information. It is high level science, and the science isn't necessarily settled yet, but what about all the people's lives? Why are people dropping dead? Why are poorer people getting worse off quicker? Is it fair that the diet is so terrible in poorer communities, and why? So we started quite quickly to look at that, because we all believed in, you can't not see it in this country. It can't not matter to you. So that's where we went with Eat Better South Africa, which became such an important part of the movement, because it built a massive amount of evidence around, just the actual kind of visual impact and ideological, I want to say, but later on the scientific impact of what has now become low carbohydrate science.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think what you're basically saying is there's no such thing as bad publicity. I mean, you actually used what could have been adverse publicity in your favor. And I mean, it's just to me, it's like a no-brainer. I mean, on the one hand, you're trying to make people healthier. On the other hand, you're actually trying to save governments and health authorities tremendous amounts of money. So this should be a no-brainer. And I mean, why are there such challenges in overcoming the resistance and overcoming the pushback? It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a question that we've asked multiple people, certainly at our own government organizations. Here it's called the Department of Health. And from very early on, we did go there with budget examples and diet and meal plans and evidence and say, right, we think we can save you X in the next 10 years. And it's so much that it's, like this could really change and pivot the future of South Africa, because you will have money to do other things that you now just pumping into chronic disease. And I mean, of course, we were told why they didn't take it seriously at the time, which was, we were focusing on getting lights up. We're focusing on clean water. We're focusing on very basic sanitation. And you're asking us to go in and change food systems and give people quality food when all we're trying to do is fill tummies. So it's, ideologically, budget-wise, readiness-wise, understanding of the diet, and then of course at the same time was this massive like dubiousness and skepticism around if it is actually settled science. And that's one of the big problems that we're now facing, certainly globally, but as a foundation, we've kind of said, well, actually, our job is to keep questioning the science, to keep saying we've got to keep pushing. This can't just be, science can't be suppressed. New voices that come through with new stories and anecdotal evidence and that are pioneering new frontiers cannot be suppressed. And we're seeing this in so many other areas now, not just chronic disease. It's like as we push and start to look at the treatment of cancer and the treatment of other conditions in all areas of medicine and other areas of science, we've got to stay listening. We've got to stay curious. And something happened that's happened for a very long time in academia, which I saw happening to Tim Noakes, who is just such an innovative, pioneering scientist. He was just being suppressed and silenced to the point that he was pushed out of his university and really, really forced, it was very, very serious what happened to him. And anyone that had less resources, probably the ultimate outcome would have been either complete and utter silencing, if not suicide. He stayed very true and very clear and kept his story because I'm not going to say he didn't have a lot to lose, because he lost so much, but he was at a point in his career where he was about to retire. His job wasn't necessarily on the line. Like, he could take risks, and he's the person that was prepared to, because it saved his life. So but there were a lot of people in the low carb movement that we have to thank for their bravery and courage, and he's definitely one of them, because he's one of the reasons why the science is here. He's one of the reasons why we were able to, as an organization, kind of establish trainings and then publish the first medical textbook and do things that helped again to legitimize what we know to be true.
Yeah, and it's about academic freedom and the right to question science, which I know is something that you're involved in as well. And I just like to differentiate science, which is still one of the best tools we have, differentiate science from the scientific establishment, which is a completely different thing, which is people tend to be conservative and resistant to change, and they've got their cherished ideas, which they don't want to give up. And it's all human stuff. So I try and differentiate science from the establishment, because they're kind of different things. But I'd love to just get on to Eat Better South Africa. And so what I first want to ask you, I mean, when I know that the advice through Noakes Foundation, Eat Better South Africa, I mean, it's obviously reached the affluent society within South Africa. But I also know South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world, with this huge gulf between rich and poor, advantaged and disadvantaged. And obviously everyone needs to eat within a budget. But so has your message reached rich and poor alike? And I guess what goes with that, one sometimes comes across this notion that healthy eating is only for the advantaged and for the rich. So with a limited budget, can one still eat healthily in South Africa, is the question.
So that's what we set out to test at Eat Better South Africa. We didn't know. We thought it was possible. We hoped it was possible. We had a few, very early on when we ran our first pilot, we had a few community leaders that came to us and said, it is possible, and we're going to do this. So it was very much kind of a wing and a prayer at that point. And we went into our first community, and we a group of 60 people signed up for the first pilot, which we weren't expecting. It was 59 women and 1 man, and we had to accept the man because he was morbidly obese. So it was kind of a women's group with a token man. And that was really interesting because what happened on that pilot, which was only 6 weeks, the first pilot we ran, was the results were absolutely exceptional, so exceptional that we were compelled to continue. So they were like startling stories that we've never really seen before. We hadn't at that point. People that had never been on diets that were just taking in their trousers every week by kind of inches and losing massive amounts of weight, and lives were changed. So it was very much like, will this work? Can we do this? Will people even stick to it? Can they afford it? And they did. Ocean View is it's not a very poor community. It's fixed abodes, so it's not a township environment. People have incomes. They had structured ways that they could access food, so they were able to kind of get meats and eggs and things that some other communities might not be able to get. But what we later did, once we knew that it worked, because that was our test, we rolled out 14 further pilots straight after that in a range of income environments. And our poorest community we went down to at the time was 13 South African rands a day per person, which is, I don't know what that is in Canadian dollars, but it's about 80 US dollar cents per day. And that was one of our more successful communities. So what we discovered was that it was actually extremely, I'm not going to say extremely easy, but it was very possible for people on any budget to change their diet and to eat a low-carb diet with a bit of support. So we had a dietitian that was looking at exactly what they ate and then putting in creative substitutes. It was not perfect. So they were not having, the perfect kind of ketogenic diet, the perfect Banting diet, but they were having excellent food. And they were getting it right and were being very, very resilient. And then what was very interesting for us as well was when we did sustainability tests and studies, was the large percentage of people stuck to the diet for more than 2 years without supervision or support. And they influenced at least 11 other people in their communities to eat better. So not necessarily to go into full intensive ketogenic transition, but to change the way that they ate and to change the way that they structured the macros on the plate. So what was very clear was that it was like poorer communities were waiting for something to be given to them that was educational, and they hadn't been given that in the past. Yeah,
that is just amazing. That's incredible. And look, I love the fact that you're calling it Eat Better South Africa, not Eat Perfect South Africa. It suggests to me you're pragmatic. Pretty much anything is better than nothing. But it's just wonderful work. It's so encouraging to hear that, so uplifting, and it must really empower those people.
Well, I think that was a really, really important, the name was extremely important for us and for the evolution of the movement. We were all doing the perfect diet at that time. We were having kind of everything from our MCT oils to our grass-fed steaks to free-range organic eggs. And it was like quite extreme and quite expensive. And we didn't know that it was ourselves, we didn't know it was possible, those of us that were on the team, that you could have such success with limited means and with imperfection. And that was what we kind of went around finding was we very early on in the first intervention, we discovered that people just couldn't do it without a substitute for millipup, which you know what that is, but your viewers don't. So millipup is a maize meal that's a highly refined white maize-based porridge that's actually really used for animal feed, but in South Africa, it's perceived to be a traditional food, which is not. If you look back far enough, it actually came in with the Portuguese colonists. So we went and found somebody that could make affordable substitutes to pap. And we knew that that wasn't a perfect way to do it, but we said, you've got to get this under 30 Rand a bag, which is quite little. That's about $150 US for a bag of about 10 servings. So we said, we're not going to get people that are living on pap as 90% of their macros to give it up. We can't get people to give things up easily. Especially people that live in difficult circumstances. There's a lack of cold chain management or accessibility. A lot of people don't have fridges. So we're seeing, and you know, the story in South Africa, I guess, is we see a lot of people that eat only things that are ready-made. For example, 2-minute noodles. Kids eat that because they make it themselves. You don't need a stove or a fridge to make those. So they'll typically have like that plus a cooked meal that mom makes them in the evenings, and that's all they eat in the day. So how do we get that better? Well, we halve the noodles and we add eggs, you know, and we start to do things that are very creative just to balance that meal off a bit better, not perfectly. And that's made a massive difference. And so I would hypothesize that that's one of the reasons that has nationally slowed down the deterioration of metabolic health in the country is the spillover effects of that, combined with the extraordinary work of a woman called Rita Fenter, who has a group called the Banting 7-Day Meal Plans, which has, I think, over 3 million people in it, many of which are from the Eat Better South Africa communities. And that's a huge kind of accessible support group that has a massive influence on community eating. So there's a lot of things going on that have supported the country's awareness that they should be eating better and finding better, more creative solutions. But that's not to say that our country is eating healthily. I mean, I think that would be a complete overstretch. Like, things are still pretty bad. The average South African is still eating a very, very distorted plate. And there is a lot of work to be done around how to get accessible, balanced food to the masses in this country.
Right. So I think just for the clarity for our viewers, millipap can be rephrased as maize, but it can also, in North America, we tend to call it corn. So it would be like a corn meal, a sort of a staple, very inexpensive diet in South Africa, which just so many people eat it, and it seems often that that's all they eat to me. And so I'm just wondering, when you substitute or you add something to it, is it a protein that you're adding, or specifically how do you make it more nutritious?
So we've got a couple of, the best example of that is something that we have called Hebapap, which was actually made for our programs originally. And that is made of sunflower, flax, and something else in there, I forgot, a coconut flour. So that's kind of the most keto-friendly, compliant. It's got quite a high, very low carb ratio. And then there are a couple of other different versions of pap in South Africa that are the range of that. So we've got an amazing program here called Start Well that feeds children in schools. I think they're feeding over 200,000 children now. That's peanut flour based. With a little bit of wheat added. So different ways of kind of mixing in flours and balancing the macros. None of them are perfect. They all come with, different challenges, different areas. But again, what we're trying to do is say, how are we going to get things better? And particularly, we work quite closely with the Startwell Foundation and did some pilots in a couple of the township schools in the Western Cape. And what we saw was that the existing school meals, which we knew anyway, school meals are really very problematic in kind of government schools in South Africa. So we have a system here where children don't get fed lunch. I think that's different in Canada. I believe your children get lunch at school. But what we have here is where teachers identify at-risk children, and they are taken out of at break time, and they are given a subsidized lunch. So it's only a small percentage of children that actually get lunch, and those lunches tend to be past shelf life bread. Retail outlets sponsor kind of past expiry date. It's mostly breads and some vegetables that is turned into a mush slop. That's really the best way I could describe it. It's very, very difficult to imagine. It's difficult to see it being made. It's unpalatable, and it's just a health bomb. So what we've tried to do is to work with some pilots and say, okay, how are we going to get this better? So it's not to say that there isn't things like tinned fish, but what we learned quite quickly is when a person says they have a bowl of millipap and they put 2 portions of chicken in, we thought they were talking about like our understanding of portions, which is, a hand size. But what they actually were talking about were up to 2 teaspoons. And it's the same with the perception of a portion of vegetables. It's about a teaspoon. So actually, when someone says they've added 2 portions of vegetables, it's mostly a big bowl of white starch and then 2 tiny micro flecks, which are kind of the sauce of either a teaspoon of something like sardines or pilchards and or tinned vegetables. And
Yeah.
that we know is not going to take children into life in a metabolically or brain functional healthy way. So that is what has to change quite quickly. And it's not necessarily more expensive. Packaged processed foods are quite pricey. And kind of more fresh, natural products like fresh eggs and things that can be purchased in underserved communities or anywhere don't tend to necessarily be much more. So it's more a
That
question of prioritization and
yeah.
planning.
Yeah. Now that's amazing though. And I mean, you've mentioned, I think you said 13 or 14 pilot projects that you've been involved in, which is incredible. And so here in British Columbia, I think you're way ahead of us, and we can learn a lot from you. But we just kind of starting off with 2 pilot projects, and I'm honored to say that my community of Tumbler Ridge, small little place in the northeastern British Columbia in the Rocky Mountains, but population 2,500. But we are one of the 2 pilot sites for trying to get type 2 diabetes into remission and everything that goes with that. So we're a pilot site for that. But I'm just really intrigued by what you've done and the successes that you've had. Obviously, you need clinicians and nutritionists and dietitians that buy into what you're talking about, that aren't old school, as it were. But the other thing that I see in what you're talking about, because we have a real problem in Canada and in British Columbia with Indigenous health and what we call First Nations communities here. It's not called that in South Africa. But these communities are bearing the brunt of the type 2 diabetes epidemic, and the numbers and the severity, they're worse in First Nations communities. And many times it's not, will I develop diabetes one day? It's when am I going to get it? Because just about everybody gets it. And it's tragic, and it's one of the things that we really want to devote our attention to. So I'm just wondering what commonalities and analogies you might see with what we're trying to do and what you've obviously done so well already with 14 pilot projects. That's astonishing.
But we had 14 pilot projects in the first 2 years, but we're now on year 9. So we've done many more since then. And that's actually the key, I think, that's made our programs widespread, is that we were rushing. So we were not getting it right, we were not getting it perfect, and that we called it Eat Better. And ultimately we actually had to split off from our mothership, which was the Noakes Foundation, because of the fact that it was messy. And it was a community project, and it wasn't perfect. It wasn't optimal. It wasn't ideal. Difficult things have to be done in local communities, and trade-offs have to be made. And we were quite impatient, I think is maybe the best word. We wanted to see the work impact people and get that information out there. So we now it's taken us some time. We have been quick. We've had a bigger impact than we thought, but it hasn't been as quick as we'd hoped. So we hope that by now we'd have kind of at least 1,000 clinics implementing our programs and several thousand coaches out there. We don't, but we do have one state clinic that actually has a room for us and runs continuous groups of patients through us. And that's a really interesting new pilot, because it's groups of patients that have comorbidities. Typically they're HIV positive, they have tuberculosis and or diabetes, if not a plethora of other comorbidities with that. And it's been quite an interesting pilot, because the combination of all the medications that they're on, plus the addition of the ketogenic diet, has been very successful for many of them and very adverse effects for some of the others, which is equally important, is how we manage comorbidities and complexities like that. But what has happened and why they've kept the clinic running is because the morale of the patients has been so dramatically improved. So their mental health has improved, and that's allowed them to manage all of their morbidities better, their comorbidities better. But HIV patients that have had HIV for a very long time have been struggling with, medication management, just so many things. They have such difficult lives. And what we've seen is that the group programs that we've developed are very successful, not only at helping health, but also morale, feelings of community and connection, and being a part of something, which is such an important part of the healing journey and kind of community journey.
Yeah, and I've heard that from so many people that I've spoken to, that, if you feed the brain what it wants and it needs, I mean, sure, you're going to get weight loss and you're going to get type 2 diabetes remission or reversal, but as a bonus, you're going to get an improvement in your mental health. It's unbelievable. And I'm interested to hear that you're seeing that as well. So again, I mean, so much of what you're saying here is really innovating and positive. And when I compare what you're doing with what we're trying to do here in British Columbia, I mean, there's a group, the IPTN, Institute for Personalized Therapeutic Nutrition, that actually supports this podcast. And these pilot projects are part of that. But there's also the desire to train and to educate, and that's being developed sort of as we speak. And I guess that brings me on to the Nutrition Network and what you're doing through that. And I think it just started off as something you thought would be local and blossomed into something that's international now.
Well,
Global.
to be honest, a large part of it came from Eat Better South Africa, because we were going into new areas. So we were trying to spread our wings and take our community work wider than just around where we lived. And our staff got a bit fatigued because there was a lot of travel involved, and you're sort of sitting in a community township hall every Saturday for a number of times, and then you start to need to grow the team. And with that, as we expanded our footprint, we needed to find doctors in particular and nurses that understood the science, because on every program we would say we'd have typically about 50 people sign up. About 10 of those would need medical assistance through the journey. So they would have abnormal bloods, they would need medication tweaks. So we'd find a local doctor and they would just say no. That was it. And we would then have to go through this training journey and this kind of conversion journey. And a lot of the time they would still say no. And then we'd have our doctors kind of driving in and zooming in. It became very difficult to manage. And it was very obvious that the medical community nationally in South Africa just didn't really understand low carb. We sort of thought, okay, this will be an easy thing. They'll just manage their hypertensive drugs and insulin and work with us. But they just said no. And then they said no to the patients. So we started to get quite frustrated. A lot of these things that we've built have come from frustration and impatience. And we started to say, this is ridiculous. Well, how are we going to quickly train people? Do we have something that we can put them through? How's this all going to work? And that was when we built these initial trainings. And it also came from my going to see a cardiologist who was on our listing on our website, that he was listed as a low-carb cardiologist. And then I spent an hour having a kind of heated debate with him about different diet approaches. And I was irritated because I was like, get him off that list. And then I thought, hell, what about the rest of the people on that list that we've been referring people to for years? We need to know that there's actually some kind of context. We need to check these people. And I'm not going to trawl around having, faking it as a mystery shopper for the next 2 years. So we then decided to start going, okay, let's train, let's give practitioners just the tools that they need, the basics. And as you said, it didn't actually affect South Africa as much as it did the rest of the world. So we're now in over 100 countries, and we never expected that. That was a blessing. We really wanted to just train 30 South African doctors so that we would have people to send our communities and our patients to. Because another aspect was that Tim Noakes, who's just the most generous man with his knowledge, when I joined the foundation, I think he had over 10,000 unread emails, and he had flagged all the ones that he was going to reply to. And when I started to, I could never get him to do writing because he was so busy replying to these emails. And it was kind of like, someone who had gout in Benoni that he wanted to send a very articulate reply to. So eventually we banned him from his inbox so that we could get him to write papers and actually start training doctors and kind of share. Everyone was coming to him in the whole of South Africa because he was the only person that was the Banting doctor, and he had no time available. So it again came very much from organically these things came to us and we had to do what was needed.
Yeah. So when I send Tim an email and I don't get a response, I've got you to blame for it. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's
What I can
fantastic.
That's good. So one thing I can just let you know in Canada, we have when I organize medical conferences and often have a theme of type 2 diabetes reversal and things like that. But in Canada, as in South Africa, all the physicians have to get hours accreditation to maintain their licensing. And I think in South Africa, you call it CPD points or something like that. And so if there's even a whiff of any drug industry involvement in the conference that I'm organizing, there is no accreditation. And so it's a way. So I mean, if we were, not that I would want to bring drug companies in, but if I were to do that, we're not going to get people attending the conference because they won't get their hours, they won't get their accreditation. So it's one way of just, we've done okay in that respect, that we've managed to pretty much eliminate any bias or industry involvement in our conferences. We just try to go with the science. So one little thing we can say we're doing okay in Canada, but I want to, yeah, sorry.
It's definitely not the same here. I know that CPD
Yeah.
is offered by pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah. No, I mean, I can see the difference over the last 10, 20, 30 years. That's in that respect, we're moving in a positive direction. But so how many people have you trained? Can I just ask you, so do you have numbers?
We're somewhere between 8 and 10,000 at the moment. I haven't checked recently. So there's a
Yeah.
good between 8 and 10,000 physicians, dietitians,
Yeah.
coaches more recently, and nurses, which is a big audience for us as well. That hopefully, and obviously our dream is that wherever the training comes from, and there are new amazing trainings coming out now that are localized, you're going to get to. I want to be able to land. I landed in hospital in the USA a couple of years ago after a flight after fainting on a flight, and didn't eat the food and was arguing with the nurses. And it's like, I would love to know that if something happens to me or someone that I love, there's somebody at the hospital or wherever they are that actually understands what they're doing and doesn't try to kind of force on them sugar-coated cereal for
Yeah.
days on end.
We
I mean,
can
it's
dream.
terrible.
It's at the moment it's a dream, but we can dream.
Well, it's
But
not. I mean, in South Africa, I think you're pretty likely to have somebody that understands somewhere
yeah,
around.
I don't think.
Conversation grown,
Yeah, yeah,
We're
I don't
getting.
think we're there yet here.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, yeah, you've got to be grateful for any progress that gets made. But yeah, again, so emboldened to hear the progress that you're making. We're in a position right now where we've got some funding to recruit nutritionist, dietitian to our region. And I'm shouting out to everybody that will listen. Yeah, don't just get a warm body, get someone that understands what we're talking about. It's
Yes.
critical. Otherwise, you're going backwards.
Yes, and I mean, ultimately, what we have to do is we have to train doctors, that for first year, like we have to change the way that education in medicine is offered so that there is an understanding of metabolic disease. And at the end of the day, I mean, I was having a chat with Dr. James Muir. I was in Australia this month, at the Low Carb Down Under. And ultimately, what has to happen is that medicine has to recognize insulin resistance as an actual disease so that it starts to get training, treatment pathways, tests are prioritized. Until that point, it's just going to be like in stage, we're looking at diabetes, we're mopping up. And we want, the new generation of medical students need to understand what's going on early on and be trained on it.
Exactly. So I'm delighted that in the conferences that I organize, we get the medical residents coming, and at least I know that group we have given some good information. But can I just ask, do you have a database of physicians in South Africa that you can refer to or that accept and understand what we're talking about here? Or how do you access them?
So we've got a database that is anyone that's done our trainings anywhere in the world that wants to be on it. And that's the problem. That is a very small microcosm of the people that have done the trainings. And we know why. But of course, we disagree with them and would like them to be loud and proud in the fact that they're doing this work. So obviously there's also the Society for Metabolic Healthcare Professionals that's doing similar and has these listings, kind of drop-in search listings. But what fascinates me is that it's under 10% of people that do the trainings that want to be listed as a low-carb practitioner. And we understand why. We talk to them. They say they're doing it for themselves. They eat low carb, but they're not ready to kind of come out as practicing or going against the trend, which is absolutely tragic until we get to the point where people really talk about it and start to actually share that knowledge. How are we going to change everything? And everything needs to change the system. That's the difficult part of this all. Is when I came into this at the Noakes Foundation, I thought we're going to kill this in a year or two. Like it's so obvious, the science is almost settled. We got a big, huge pot of funding in for research when I first joined, and we put it into place. And it was like, within 2 to 10 years, this is all going to be settled. And here we are. Of course, we now all know what a big system we're looking at changing. And it's everything from the soil to the medicine that we're given to everything in between. There's a huge process that we're going through, and we are in it. It's not like nothing's happened. That we might not feel like we're at the tipping point yet, but the work that's been done in these years is all contributing towards the societal change we need to see happening to give our next generation on Earth a chance at metabolic health and a slightly easier life, hopefully.
Yeah, and what I'm hoping is that you're going to reach critical mass. And that's been shown so many times that you think you're not getting anywhere, and all of a sudden you've reached critical mass, and then things just take off. So that's what I'd love to see. So look, I would like to sign up for one of your courses, and I promise you I will wear it as a badge of honor, and you can put my name wherever for what it's worth. But yeah, I wanted to mention too, just for fun, I am a paleontologist as well. And when I was in South Africa at a place called Brenton-on-Sea, which you might know, on the Cape South coast, in a cave there, I discovered 90,000-year-old human trackways. And the interesting thing is, one of the people there, probably a male, from his gait, we could see that he was running. And this was the oldest evidence of humans running in the world. So who did I contact? Tim Noakes. And I was just absolutely privileged and delighted that Tim joined me as a co-author on the paper which we published on that. So I tell all my friends, yeah, I was lead author on a paper with Tim Noakes as co-author, which I thought was very ironic. But what interests me, though, the reason I'm mentioning that is evolutionary biology, and the fact that it almost seems to me like we've been, in the last 50 years, since the 1970s, we've been forced to eat stuff which we really are not designed to eat, and which we've never eaten in our millions years of history. And all of a sudden, we're eating so much of that. So would you agree with that? I mean, where did we go wrong? Can we pinpoint where we went wrong?
So I was a brand manager. I don't often admit it, but one of my first jobs was at our largest bread and pharmaceutical manufacturer, Adcock Ingram and Tiger Brands. And, what I don't think is that it's useful to blame. So, I don't think that there's any one entity that's out there to get us, and people buy what they want to eat. And to a large extent, brand management marketing is consumer-led. And I've had these conversations with many people that work in big bread and big food industry since I've been in this low carbohydrate area. And I've said to them, what are you guys doing? You know that this is a problem. Some of them have built plants and taken low carb bread out and had to close them within months because no one bought the bread. So it's like the consumers have a role to play in this. We are the ones that buy the bread. We are the ones that buy the pup. We're the ones that buy the rice. And until that changes, manufacturing's not really going to change with it because they're not going to make money. It's very simple. It's like this is a free market that we live in. So we can't blame. We are addicted to refined carbohydrates and sugars, and we are prioritizing those and buying those, and that is creating an industry that is making us sick. So we're all in it together. And I think the work is to say, okay, well, how do we change this in a way that's sustainable so that we survive as a species? And that means that we want our soil to survive. We want to start looking at like agricultural systems and how they could be different. You know, in South Africa, and I'm sure I think it's the same in North America and Canada, it's most of our biodiversity has been replaced by soya, canola, wheat, maize, and like the big five. And how do we bring it back? How do we start to pull diversity back? How do we change food systems? Why are we eating this way? How do we look at our own world and start to actually shop, like it's purse power, I call it, because certainly here about 80% of shopping is done by women, and that's moms and, home cooks. And we are the ones that dictate what goes into the food basket, which dictates what goes into the fields. And we have to kind of all take responsibility for it. So I'm kind of giving you how I think we're going to change this more than why, but we know why. And it's also because I was told when I was 21 and I was told that I had PCOS, that I should follow a whole grain, low GI diet. So I printed off the GI list and stuck it on my fridge, and I only ate low GI for 10 years, and then got sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker, and then ate more and more low GI, thinking it would help, and it made me worse and worse. So I'm angry. I was angry. I was angry at like the system that created the diet that I followed that made me sick. And the solution to all of this is to fix it. We've got to fix it. We can't let our children go through what we had to go through. We don't want to have to rebel. We don't want to have to be kind of rage against the machine, going through years of trauma and trials like Tim Noakes went through. It should be simple, but the science needs to be debated and discussed in a much more cohesive and positive way. And that's part of the problem, is all the mudslinging isn't helping us get to the real solution here. There's a lot of work. We all have a lot of work to do, but also it doesn't have to be as difficult as it's been. I think we all agree we want things to be better, healthier, and it's very visually obvious that things aren't good and they need to be fixed. Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible. I'm glad you mentioned PCOS. And I just sympathize with your own journey, listening to your doctors. But I can say that there's nothing more fulfilling to a physician and obviously to a patient that goes on to a low-carb diet for their PCOS. And the next thing, well, not the next thing, but it takes a while, but then they become pregnant. That is what an amazing outcome.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's just fantastic.
Really, really amazing.
Yeah. And just, I want to ask you a final question before I wrap up, but kids are so important to everybody. And I know you've done some work with the fact that in South Africa, kids just get given sugar drinks rather than milk and formula. And I also know you're doing some work on stunting of kids, young kids. So is that the same as looking at protein, energy, malnutrition, and kwashiorkor, or is that a different thing? And how do you address all that?
So this is a project that we did, the pilot that I mentioned earlier, with a low-carb porridge producer.
Okay.
And it is the same story. So we don't see childhood obesity in kind of our underserved communities. We see stunting and malnutrition diseases.
Yeah.
So what we looked at in that study was taking out all the refined carbs and putting in better macronutrients, and then looking over time at the actual growth and kind of cognitive markers. And it's still quite kind of in process. It's a bit early to say. It's been a very difficult study to implement, because what we see is, they're going back to eating what they ate. It's quite a difficult community to work in. We're also about to work and collaborate with a pilot that actually takes an entire group of schools that are residential. So there's a lot more impact on like how the long-term application of the more balanced diet with them. So these childhood studies are difficult. We have only just in the last 2 years started to do some pilots, because it's such a difficult community. It's such a sensitive community, but it's also the most important community. And we know that the problems are the same as we all know that obesity, malnutrition, and kind of stunting and malnutrition diseases are the similar problem, just presenting differently in different communities.
Yeah, it's all part of a spectrum. Yeah, quite right. Yeah. So it seems, Jayne, that we actually have a fair amount in common. In in that both of us believed what we were told. You as a patient, you listened to your doctors. Me as a training physician and as a practicing physician, I listened to my teachers, my tutors. None of them were malicious in telling me the wrong thing. They honestly told me what they believed was true, but I just accepted it. My dad tried to teach me always to question, but I didn't question it this time. I thought, no, these folks know what they're doing. I can just believe what they're telling me. And I think we both emerge sadder but wiser. You've spoken about the immensity of the problem that lies ahead, and you're absolutely right. And I think what basically keeps us going is that if we don't try, we're going to fail no matter what. And we might fail anyway, but hopefully not. And I'm just so encouraged by your approach of, pragmatic, something is better than nothing. We have to be grateful for small gains. And I agree with you, but don't get into the blame game. But what irritates me is just back in the 1970s, those people that foisted this whole system on the world, basically, first world, third world, it didn't matter. This became the accepted dogma, and we now know they were wrong. But in being wrong, they were just so convinced that they were right, almost to a point of arrogance. And we're still paying the price today in that it's just what we were taught, what I was taught as a kid and as a medical student, etc. It's dogma. It's still out there. We're still having to try and push back against this. But the way I try and do it, I try and replace that hubris, because that was hubris, that was hubristic, and I try and replace it with humility. When I give a talk on something like this, I try and say to people, look, don't just accept this because I'm telling you this. Question everything I'm telling you. What are my sources? Where am I getting it from? Why am I telling you this? Ask all those questions, so trying to be, as best I can, trying to be humble. So any thoughts on all that?
Well, it reminds me of the quote, you do your best until you know better, and then you keep doing better. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to stay humble. We don't want to become the next version of that. We've got to stay and it is really about questioning the science and questioning the status quo, maybe more than just the science. It's like, how can we do better? What can we do that's a little bit better? How can we eat better? What is that 10%? What's the next meal going to look like? How can that next patient be helped a little bit better? And
Yeah,
on we go. How we fix the mistakes of the current dogma and the past dogma.
exactly. And so what you've given us today, Jayne, is it's a bit there's some sadder but wiser stuff there, but it's basically wisdom born of experience. And I just want to thank you for all the good work you're doing. It's empowering to me just to hear what you're up to and the successes. And I know you say there's a long way to go and it's not all perfect, but the successes that you have achieved. I'm reminded of David Unwin, whom you probably know, whom I also interviewed on this podcast. And he had exactly the same experience in the beginning where his colleagues, he told them what he wanted to do, and they said, no, this is nonsense. We're not going to do it as a practice. And he just did it anyway, pro bono. And now he's like the leader in the UK, and he's highly respected all over the place. So to me, that's the critical mass, which I'm sure you folks are going to reach in South Africa. And I just love the way you've demythologized this notion of healthy eating is for the rich only. And that's really, really, really powerful. So thank you, Jayne. I hope everyone has enjoyed listening to you and to this podcast. I would like to thank our producer, Anne Mullins. I'd like to thank Graham Wheeler, our technical whiz. IPTN, the Institute for Personalized Therapeutic Nutrition, sponsors this. I also want to thank RCCBC, the Rural Coordination Center for British Columbia. And I would just like to know, Jayne, how do we best access all the wealth of information you've given us today? We can put links up here and help people get to it. So are there any sort of top tips of how we access what you've done?
Yeah, you can find myself or any of the team on LinkedIn or any platform, Nutrition Network, Eat Better South Africa, the Noakes Foundation. We're kind of hopefully everywhere accessible, and we can share links with anyone that would like to know more.
Yeah, no, we'll put those links up along with this podcast. So just to close, I want to thank you. You've been listening to Charles Helm, that's me, interviewing Jayne Bullen, all the way from the Western Cape, near Cape Town in South Africa. Thank you, Jayne. It's been really enlightening and inspiring chatting with you, and for all our viewers, I hope that we will see you again soon. Thank you.